David C. Berliner is a renowned educational psychologist. After earning a BA and MA in psychology from California State University at Los Angeles, Berliner received his PhD in educational psychology from Stanford University. Berliner is a past president of the American Educational Research Association and of the Division of Educational Psychology of the American Psychological Association. Berliner is a Regents Professor at Arizona State University, where he has served as Dean of Education, and for the past 5 summers has been a visiting professor at SFU's Faculty of Education. Among other honors, he is an elected member of the National Academy of Education and a fellow of the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences. Berliner has authored more than 200 articles, books, and chapters in the fields of educational psychology, teacher education, and educational policy, including the bestseller, The Manufactured Crisis, and 6 editions of the textbook Educational Psychology. Recently, he co-authored Collateral Damage, How High-Stakes Testing Corrupts American Education. We welcome David Berliner to Your Education Matters. The book, The Spirit Level, David's become very popular both in UK and in North America, and it talks about the effect of inequality on human happiness. But several years before that book came out, you had done a very well-received speech at the American Educational Research Association on a similar topic, and the article that followed it in Teachers College Record has been very successful there. Would you summarize for us what you talked about and wrote about with respect to income inequality?
Sure. I got interested in the fact that so many people were blaming teachers and principals for problems with the schools. And I had grown up in New York City, in the Bronx, and urban kid, working class neighborhood, but I knew poor people, and I had poor kids in my school. And it was quite clear that they suffered from things I didn't suffer from with a stable family that earned a living, low as it was. And so I just got interested in this as the pitch of attacking teachers in schools got higher and started looking around. For example, in the Bronx today, 30% of the people in the Bronx today are below the poverty level, and the state average is 15%. So you got a doubling. You've got the highest unemployment rate in the highest poverty rate in the nation in an urban area, and the highest unemployment rate in the state in the Bronx, where I grew up. And it's very hard for teachers to deal with those issues because you grow up impoverished. There are a number of side effects. Generally, a poor kid might hear, by the time they go to school, 6 million words, and a middle-class kid might hear 12 million words, and a wealthy kid might hear 20 million words, and commands and questions. Well, those are preparation for school that are unimaginable, but the rates we know now are reasonably accurate. Poor kids move a lot because they can't make the rent, and so you disrupt their lives, you disrupt the lives of the teachers who have to bring them into a new class, and you disrupt the lives of the stayers as well as the movers, because a class of 25 kids with a new kid every week or every 10 days or something changes the whole dynamic. These are kids who suffer from asthma at huge rates. Again, in the Bronx, 3 or 4 major highways crisscross the South Bronx. Their diesel trucks are running all day because it's a big market area, and the air is polluted beyond anyone's doubt. Well, when half your class is using vaporizers because they're asthmatic, it makes learning more difficult. And that's exactly what you find in the South Bronx. And it was once the country for New York, and it's not the country anymore. It's one of the worst urban environments in certainly North America. So these are the kinds of things that got me interested, that the people in New York, Mayor Bloomberg, Joel Klein, the chancellor, were blaming teachers, no excuses for poverty, but they didn't change anything because they had the wrong premise. In Chicago, our current Secretary of Education in the United States was the Chancellor of Chicago, and he didn't change anything because he had the wrong premise. The premise is that kids are lazy, teachers are lazy, everybody's sloughing off, and all you have to do is fix them in some way and get the bad teachers out. But the real issue is that society has failed our teachers, society has failed our kids, society has failed their families in not providing them with jobs, opportunities. I could fix the education system easily in the United States, get people decent paying jobs. Middle class people have kids who do pretty well in school, and poor families don't. It seems patently obvious, and the lovely thing about the spirit level is that these are two epidemiologists who studied all the problems, the social problems different nations, rich nations have. And a rather amazingly clear social science finding came out. And the finding was a simple one. The greater the inequality in society, the more likely you're going to be bad on a social indicator. Schooling, teenage pregnancy, school dropout, drug use. You name the social outcome, the greater the social inequality in the society, the worse you look. Well, these are epidemiologists. They're looking upstream. That's what epidemiologists look for. Here are the symptoms. What are the causal factors beyond it? And they have just nailed it, I think. And I've been on that for some time. One more piece here that's important. What I recognized as a kid in New York was the lack of time we spend in school. I've since studied it, and if you take the waking hours of a typical kid for a year, they're in school about 1,000 of their waking hours, and they're out of school with family and neighborhood about 5,000 hours. 5 to 1 is the ratio of the possible power of family and neighborhood on a kid's future. That's a lot different than people think. Schooling is very powerful. It's not. In fact, we computed the data, and at age 18, the typical American child, I assume it's pretty similar for Canada, the typical American child has spent less than 10% of their life in school. Well, if your family's not strong and healthy, if your neighborhood's not strong and healthy, teachers have a very hard time overcoming it. I think it's miraculous how well they do.
Well, to some extent, we're preaching to the converted here in Canada, I know, because I came up here from Fresno, California, which won the #1 award for greatest density of poverty of any American city. And the rhetoric there would be that if we use poverty as a reason why our school numbers weren't as good as other cities in California, we were told we were making excuses. So I tried that out on a Canadian business person. I was at a Board of Trade meeting, and I tried that question out. I asked him what he thought about the effect of poverty on school performance, and he said, well, of course it would have an effect. And I thought, well, I've certainly come to a new land now, because that would have never come out of the mouth of the business community where I had been. And Canada puts its money where its mouth is, too, I noticed. For example, you mentioned the mobility problem. The poorer the school, the more the kids are in and out, disrupting their school year and their ability especially to learn to read. Here in Canada, one of the programs I noticed in British Columbia that's got a good bit of traction, over 100,000 families receive rent subsidies explicitly for the purpose of preventing them from having to move. Now, I don't hear Canadians connect that to school performance explicitly, but they seem to have gut level understanding that you've got to elevate people to a certain level of financial stability before anything in their life is going to work well. And so the rent subsidy program helps us in education, although I'm not sure that that was the intent of it.
I agree completely. We found a school in Rochester, New York, where a classroom had over 100% mobility. There were 3 kids who showed up in September that were still there in June, and the rest of the class had cycled in and some back, okay? Well, I'm told the teacher responsible for student achievement, whether that teacher's responsible for welcoming them, hugging them, trying to be a nice friend to them, but you're not going to get a lot of achievement out of that class. It's just impossible to do. So I think the rent subsidies is a very important one. I wish the U.S. had more stability, helping families find more stable ways to stay where they are, so the teachers can do their job.
Now, you said something about the type of research that the spirit level was based on in your own work, and I know we've talked about these terms positivist and post-positivist. Can you fit some of this into a framework so that people understand the different genres of research that go on in social science like education?
Yeah, I think the greatest invention mankind has come up with yet is science. I think that beats the wheel, it beats fire, it beats everything. Science is a terrific way of knowing with some certitude. Now notice how I said that, with some certitude. In the beginning, scientists were called positivists. They thought there was a reality out there and science would identify it and nail it. Okay, that's the positivists. The post-positivists say, you know, there's a reality out there and we'll probably never know it. And our job is to get us close to it, to find ways to make life predictable. Airplanes do fly most of the time. Microorganisms do, in fact, have effects that we know most of the time. You reinforce a little kid for using utensils, and most of the time they start using utensils. So social science and regular science and the hard sciences, all in fact are able to reduce the problems of life and get us some certitude. But knowing reality is just very hard to do. We just approximate it. And those who say there is no reality, I think, should never leave their house. Okay, they won't know how to cross the street. And those who say that, you know, that's science's job is to define reality, they misunderstand the complexities of the world we live in. One example, the effect of a tsunami on an absolutely 100% safe nuclear power plant. Well, you can't get it right, okay? Yeah. The context and problems emerge. Okay. They emerge even more so in the social sciences. That's where post-positivism is very strong, because we know that context matters. A finding here in West Vancouver may not hold in Newfoundland. It just won't. It may not even hold in North Vancouver. Findings are contextually bound by a community, by the people in it, the percent of Asians, percent of poor, wealth of the community, whether the team is winning or not, the high school football team or something. All of those matter, and I think social scientists now understand will reduce uncertainty, but we can't guarantee you certainty, and that's the post-positivist approach. Now, I think there's a side to this that people don't think about. I break up the world into most people break up the world into the hard sciences and the soft sciences. And they think the hard sciences are physics and chemistry, the soft sciences are psychology and maybe sociology and that sort of thing. I break up the world differently. I see the world as made up of hard science and easy science. And easy science is physics and chemistry. That's easy because you can control a lot of variables. Hard science is education, maybe the hardest science of them all, and maybe economics. The reason economists get most things wrong most of the time is they think they can act like physicists and run an equation out and predict what's going to happen. But it's a political world they live in, it's a social world they live in, and they get things wrong because they have no variables to put in. They can't do it. Mm-hmm. The physicist knows there's gravity, and there's force, and there's lots of other things to put into an equation, and you can predict, you know, matter pretty accurately, what's going to happen to matter. The economists are pretty much screwed up because they don't recognize that they're not physicists, and that the world is, in fact, incredibly complex. It's a bizarre world. It's a political world. It's awkward things happen. You can't predict that a piece of the stock market's going to fall out next month, or a corporation's not going to make its earnings. Well, education, I think, is one of the hardest sciences, and physics and chemistry are easy. Mm. And I think people don't understand that. So we try our best. We reduce uncertainty a little bit, but uncertainty is going to be with us because that's the post-positive world we live in.
Okay. We'll return to this theme in just a moment.
I was ready. When I first came to SFU, I thought I knew exactly what I wanted. So I started into a specialized French cohort program and got involved in the French Student Union, thinking for sure that I wanted to go into journalism. When I got into my second semester, I suddenly wasn't so sure what I wanted to do anymore. So I started to explore a little bit. Archaeology, communications, history, even kinesiology. And then I decided to go on exchange to France for a year. I was really enjoying my history classes and quickly realized that's what I wanted to study. But all the exploring I had done in other departments still counted towards my degree. I also got involved in campus life. I was an orientation leader for a year, became a community advisor in residence, helped start a choir, I even took a rowing course. Now I'm in my 5th year studying a history major and French and poli-sci minors, and I'm still involved in residence. I'm an area coordinator now and working on sustainability initiatives around campus. After SFU, I have lots of possibilities of what I could do. International development, leadership, teaching, but whatever I do, I know I'll be ready for it.
David, we took a little risk there by getting into some theory of how research is conducted and the bases of theory, but I think we can concretize it some by looking at your recent book, Collateral Damage, and how that illustrates why education science is a hard science. What did you explore in that book, and what did you find about the popularization of educational research that is reflected in Collateral Damage?
The general population thinks that the test scores actually mean something and that they can draw inferences from them. But we know that when you value the test scores too much, then they get corrupted. And there's a social science law that most politicians have never heard of. It's not exactly like the law of gravity. It's social science, but it holds just as well. And that law is called Campbell's Law. And Campbell's Law simply states the more you value an indicator, a number, the more likely it is to be corrupted, and the more likely are the people who handle it get corrupted. So if you're talking about gross domestic product in a nation, well, if it has to go up, they find ways to look like it's going up, so the stock market stays up. If you're a corporation like Enron, you invent little corporations to make yourself look good, even though you're fudging the data and actually cheating. It turns out that when you confront people with this law, they say, yeah, but my data, my district, it's good and I can depend on these data. Well, data have to be interpreted. The numbers don't mean what they seem to mean unless they have an interpretive frame around them. And if you're holding people responsible for student test scores, you're very likely to corrupt the indicator. So Michelle Rhee, who was our superintendent in Washington, D.C., there was cheating going on. Her scores went up. In New York City, Mayor Bloomberg and Joel Klein led the New York City schools to spectacular achievements. What they did was just lower the cut score for passing, so more kids looked good. In Houston, the former Secretary of Education, Rodney Page, was the superintendent in Houston. They simply lied about lots of their data, and one of the schools was cheating. If you're going to hold people responsible to make a number, then you're going to have Campbell's Law come into effect, and it's going to be corrupted. When the Russians said you had to have 100 tanks come out of the factory, 100 tanks came out of the factory. That was the number. Otherwise, you go to Siberia. But the tanks didn't work. The treads came off. The quality of Russian goods, everyone knows, was terrible because they had to make the number not do the job right. Well, we're getting that in education. People misunderstand that those numbers, if you put too much credence in them, then you're going to have people start fudging them. For example, you have the Fraser Institute in this province. They publish the numbers unadorned, as if they mean something. And if a school gets very nervous that their number is low, I can assure you next year their nervousness will turn into some gaming the system, fudging the data, outright cheating even, because their professional lives depend on it. In the US, we fire people if the scores don't go up. We take over their schools. That's high stakes. And it seems to me that people need to understand that numbers have to have interpretive frames around them, and you have to use them in a way that are humane. Otherwise, people will simply lie. In New York City once, they told the police, we're going to judge you on how many cases you solve. Well, they started solving a lot of cases. Why? Because they pick up a pickpocket and say, if you confess to these other 3 things, we'll give you less time in jail. So the pickpocket confessed to a whole bunch of things. Judge gave him less time in jail, and the rate of solutions went up, and everybody was happy. Nothing changed.
Well, it really reached a new level in Los Angeles in the last year since the publication of your book, with the publication in the LA Times of individual teachers grading them essentially for the test performance of their students.
Yeah. Well, it's no different than your rankings here. The last time I was in the province, they had a school that taught First Nations kids up north and a Vancouver Jewish day school. And one was the leader of everything, as I recall, and the other one was at the bottom. And they just compared them like they were the same thing. Well, you can't have a policy that says these schools are alike. They're not. They're absolutely different. And people can't, I mean, this is not even apples and oranges. These are apples and aardvarks, you know? I mean, they're that different. And a number doesn't stand alone. It has to be contextualized.
Now, your career's evolved over the course of your lifetime from being pretty much a straight educational researcher focused on that to moving into fields like instruction and then policy. Can you explain why that evolution has taken place in your career?
Well, some of it's just my own interest in not doing the same thing for more than 7, 8, 10 years. Just you want to do something else. And I always thought bringing fresh eyes to a problem is good. I think one of the reasons many scientific discoveries are made by 22-year-olds is that 42-year-olds don't go into new fields. But it's bringing fresh eyes that I think is the key to a field. So I was doing teaching research and got interested in some classroom behavior, started studying how teachers spend time in classrooms, and that put me into lots of classrooms. While I was in those classrooms, studying them for about a decade, I discovered some excellent teachers, and so I started looking up the research on expertise, and then spent a decade or so studying experts and finding the commonalities between expert teachers and expert golfers and expert chefs. Then I also, because I spent so much time in classrooms, discovered that people were telling lies about the schools, because I was in them and they weren't. So I wrote The Manufactured Crisis with my good colleague Bruce Biddle, and that book became a bestseller because we challenged the critics by what we actually found in the schools. And so I then became a policy person. And my career now for the last 20 years or so has been concerned with policy. And policy is the most fun in a way, because instead of publishing in a little journal, you might influence somebody who actually can change the way the world runs. So Collateral Damage was read by a senator. He had a study group. He brought together 5 other senators in the US, and they wrote a joint letter to the Secretary of Education saying, wait a minute, before you go on, you better take a look at this. My first book with Biddle on the manufactured crisis went to the Secretary of Education, who called his staff in and said, we have to stop talking about bad schools. We should talk about improving the schools. That was our argument. That's what we wanted, okay? There are schools that need improvement, but they're not bad schools, okay? Public schooling is doing a remarkable job. You know, if I take a moment, there was a quote I always use about public schools that maybe served Canadians as well. It was done by Lawrence Kremen, the historian. And he said, when the history of America is written in the 22nd century, and they look back to find out why America achieved so much in the 20th century, the answer will be found in the 19th century in the invention of the common school. It wasn't the Gatling gun, it wasn't steamboats, and it wasn't this or that. It wasn't the telegraph, it wasn't the computer, it was the invention of the common school that gave America its edge for a century. And if Canada and Western Europe and Australia keep that all in mind, they will see how valuable an invention the public schools really are.
Well, thank you, David. We'll be back in a moment. In BC and elsewhere, educators are accustomed to seeing data used as a weapon to score partisan political points at the expense of those who work in schools. The abuse of social science in the form of school rankings has, for example, obscured the proper use of data and statistics in the study of education and school renewal. School rankings are a spectacular violation of 3 traditional values of science: skepticism, rigor, and most of all, modesty. This recent history of disinformation teaches a lesson about the place of science in contemporary society and the manner in which science is popularly understood or misunderstood. A thin veneer of data and statistics is often applied to arguments in order to lend them apparent validity and give them a scientific identity. All the finer points of method and theories of knowledge are glossed over, unmentioned. On the other hand, practicing scientists, especially social scientists, are by and large modest in their claims. They understand the complexity of the human sciences and the limited role that social science can play in guiding our politics and policy making. Bona fide social scientists contextualize their claims and apply skepticism to their own work as well as that of others. Whether in economics, education, or medicine, we see grand and outrageous claims made in media that are cloaked in this veneer of scientism. As citizens and voters, the public should be warned. When science is used in simplistic forms for public relations and advertising purposes, you had better hang on to your wallet and your soul. Paid-for flacks are concealing more truth by such methods than they are revealing. Calling something science or stating claims with numbers doesn't necessarily make it true. Thank you for thinking about Your Education Matters.